The Bellamy Bird by Claire Havens. Chapter 1. Nina Bellamy carried the heavily laden laundry basket down the narrow stairs. A sock fell off the pile and tumbled out of sight. Nina balanced the wicker basket precariously on one hip as she twisted her body around in search of the missing garment. Rats! There was no room on the narrow stairway to set down the basket. Now she would have to come all the way back upstairs again to find it. Sighing, Nina hefted the basket up once more and continued downstairs. The striped sock lurked unseen behind one of the railings. Nina lived in a tall, thin house set out over 5 levels. Once upon a time there would have been servants sleeping in the attic rooms, which now belonged to Freddie and Jamie, Nina's children, and the basement kitchen would have been reigned over by a cook and possibly a housekeeper. Today, however, it was Nina that had to run up and down 5 flights of narrow stairs several times a day, and it was exhausting. She entered the warmth of the kitchen and gratefully set down the basket on the kitchen table. Violet, her grandmother, sat dozing in the wooden rocking chair next to the ancient Aga, her leather-bound photo album resting on her knees. Nina smiled and, as quietly as she could, filled the kettle and set it on to boil. Granny would be awake soon, and she liked a pot of tea when she woke up. Violet had moved in with the family a year ago and lived on the ground floor of the house in the London suburb. Before coming to live with Nina and her family, Violet lived at a nursing home in the countryside, but it became more and more expensive for her to stay there, and she found the other inhabitants' habit of dying to be depressing. Violet herself was over 90 and still going strong. After putting on the washing, Nina scooped 5 generous spoonfuls of tea leaves into the large brown teapot and covered it with a hand-knitted tea cosy. She selected 4 mugs from the hooks under the dresser and set them on the table, along with the biscuit tin. Reaching for her battered copy of The Secret Adversary, Nina sat in the window seat on a worn cushion once embroidered with bright orange and red silk flowers, and settled in to read. She loved murder mysteries, and Agatha Christie was her favourite author. As Nina put it to herself, Agatha Christie was not called the Queen of Crime for nothing. How many years had it been since her death, and still there was no one to beat her? Soon, Nina was lost in the story, trying to establish the identity of the mysterious Mr. Brown and discover just what had happened to the missing woman with the top-secret documents, Jane Finn. At precisely 4 o'clock, Violet stirred and awoke. Stretching, she looked around and smiled when she saw Nina curled up with a book in one hand, her tea in another. It was autumn, and the wind-blown garden had grown dark through the kitchen window. Violet thought they must look cosy in the kitchen from outside. From upstairs came the sound of the front door slamming shut, followed by a clatter of feet running down to the kitchen. Freddie and Jamie had arrived home from school and would be ravenous and thirsty. Violet stood up and began to pour out their tea as they hurtled in through the kitchen door. Nina looked up from her book. "Hello there, how was school?" "Okay. Is there anything to eat? I'm starving." This was Jamie, 10 years old and with twice the appetite of Nina. He tore the lid from the biscuit tin and took a handful of biscuits. He dropped his school bag on the floor by Nina's feet and pulled out one of the wooden kitchen chairs to sit down. "Thanks, Gran," he said to Violet as she passed him a mug of milky tea. Although Violet was really the children's great-grandmother, everyone in the family called her Gran. "Here you are, Freddie," Violet said. "Come and sit down and have something to eat." Freddie, or Frederica, had her head in her book and looked up vaguely at being spoken to. Smiling at her great-grandmother, she took the proffered chair and sat down. "Thanks, Granny." "What's new?" Nina asked. "Did you have a good day?" "Yes, thanks," Freddie replied, sipping her tea and reaching for the biscuit tin. "Glad it's the last day of term. Got loads of revision to do, though. Exams as soon as we get back." "That's too bad," Nina commiserated. "What about you, Jamie? Lots of holiday work?" "Not really." "Are you sure?" Nina asked with a smile. "Well, I'll have to check. Don't think so, though." This was highly unlikely, but Jamie thought it was worth a try. After tea, Nina cleared the tea things and began to prepare dinner. Freddie and Jamie had gone upstairs to get changed and put away their school bags for 3 glorious weeks. Violet set the table and helped Nina with the vegetables. It was to this scene of domestic bliss that Tom Bellamy returned. The warm kitchen and the sight of his family cheered him enormously, and he was in need of cheering up. Work was going from bad to worse, and Tom's boss had hinted that there would be more job cuts in the near future. The economy was still bad, and it seemed as though things might never improve. But it was Friday night, and he was at home. The holidays had started, and everyone would be happy. And that was enough for Tom. After dinner, the children went to bed, and Tom and Nina sat in their sitting room on the first floor. Violet was watching her television show downstairs, while Tom and Nina sat by the fire and talked. Tom filled in Nina on the ongoing saga at the office. "We'll be okay, Tom," Nina said, trying to smile. "I can try to get more hours at the library. Something will turn up, you'll see." "I wish I shared your optimism," Tom said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Still, it's the holidays now. Let's try to enjoy this time with the children." Freddie, who had come down to show them the complicated knot she had succeeded in tying in an old shoelace, was standing outside the kitchen door and heard every word. She went back to bed, worried, a sick feeling in her stomach. She picked up Swallows and Amazons. It was her favourite book, and it always helped her forget bad things. There were no such things as money troubles in the book. The children in Swallows and Amazons were always on holiday. True, their father was working and away from them, but you got the sense he loved being in the Navy, and they were all terribly proud of him. They had enough money to stay for weeks on end at a farmhouse in the country. Freddie and Jamie had never had a holiday away from home. Now it seemed Dad might not even have his job much longer. What would they do then? Freddie sighed miserably and thought about going to discuss things with Jamie, but she knew he'd be asleep by now. Snuggling further down into her blankets, she pulled the book closer, as though its very presence could protect her. The next morning, Freddie was pale and drawn as she helped settle Violet into a chair in the garden. It was a lovely autumn morning, and the scruffy little garden was a sun-trap. Freddie took up the broom that stood against the side of the house and began sweeping up the dead leaves that had blown over the fence from next door. Freddie always liked things ship-shape. She had already shown Violet the knot she'd made, and Granny had seemed most impressed. Jamie was outside too, trying to find a forked stick sturdy enough to use as a catapult or slingshot. He'd found an enormous elastic band in the kitchen drawer and had a supply of dried conkers from last year. He had a vague idea that the smug-looking, pampered cat from next door might be useful for target practice. "Are you all right, Freddie?" Violet asked. Her bright blue eyes missed nothing. "Yes, thanks, Gran." Freddie continued sweeping. The coarse bristles scratched the stone paving slabs. Jamie called out from across the grass. "Here's a beauty!" He brandished the stubby stick and fumbled in his jacket pocket for the band. After a few exploratory twangs, he loaded the catapult with a conker and aimed, one eye closed, tongue protruding from his mouth. "Bullseye!" Freddie and Violet looked at each other and smiled. "That's a fine catapult you've got there, Jamie," Violet called out. Her voice was still strong and friendly. "I used to have a corker of a catapult when I was a girl. Many's the beating I received for hitting people with it." Freddie gasped. "Granny, I can't believe you were ever naughty." Violet twinkled at her. "I was quite a naughty little thing. I feel sorry for my mother, always trying to turn me into a proper young lady. I must have been quite a trial to her." Violet shook her head sadly. "Who did you hit with your catapult?" Jamie asked, looking for ideas. "I believe my governess was the main victim." Violet leaned back in her chair and tilted her head back, searching her memory. "Of course, there were lots of people who came to the house, and servants who were on the receiving end of a few conkers when they were least expecting them." "Servants," Freddie said wonderingly. She had known, of course, that Granny Violet, really great Granny Violet, had grown up in Alnbury Manor, and that she'd had a governess and maids and things, but Freddie had never really thought about what it must have been like. Violet reached down the side of her chair for her ever-present photo album. Her fingers briefly caressed the smooth leather cover, which had the image of a bird embossed on it. Her bent fingers sought amongst the pages for the photo she wanted to show the children. "Here it is. My parents had a photo taken every year of the household. Here's Miss Wilkes, my governess." Freddie peered at the dim faces in the sepia photograph. It captured 7 people standing in rows in front of an impressive-looking house. Lush trees stood on either side of the house, and 2 stone lions guarded the front door. Violet's finger pointed to a tall lady standing in the back row, next to a lady in a long white dress, and a man with a neat beard and moustache. Freddie knew these were her great-great-grandparents, Violet's parents. Miss Wilkes, the governess, frowned at the camera, squinting in the bright light that stretched long shadows across the lawn. Jarvis, the butler, loomed impressively. Violet stood in the front row, next to 2 seated housemaids, white caps neat and smiles on their young faces. Freddie peered at Violet's face, trying to find traces of the old lady sitting next to her, in the young open face. Violet beckoned Jamie over. "Look here, Jamie, see this tree?" Her gnarled hand had moved across the photo, and she pointed out an enormous cedar tree that stood to the right of the house. "Yes?" Jamie bent his head over the page. "I used to be able to climb almost to the top of that tree." Jamie gaped at her, impressed. "Really?" "Really. I could climb up to here." She pointed to a spot about 3/4 up the tree, just before the branches thinned out. "I discovered that if I climbed up this side of the tree and then swung around here, I could just reach the stone balcony and I would pull myself up and over and go back into the house." Jamie looked at the photo and then at Violet. "I wish we had a tree I could climb like that. What was on the other side of the balcony?" "It was a bedroom. I used to love jumping out on people who came to stay. Of course, that was another source of punishment." A small smile lit up her face. Poor Miss Wilkes. The 3 of them leaned over the photo, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, a gust of wind blew the thin sheet of protective paper back over the photograph. Violet sighed and closed the book. "It must have been amazing living in a house like that, Granny," said Freddie. "Tell us about it again, will you?" Jamie pulled his penknife from his pocket. It was a cheap one from a Christmas cracker. More than almost anything, Jamie longed for a real Swiss Army knife, the kind with tools for taking stones out of horses' hooves and a tin opener. However, the Christmas cracker one wasn't too bad and would do until he could save up for his dream knife. He began stripping the bark from a thick piece of stick, content to sit and listen. Granny was always happy to regale the children with tales of her childhood at Alnbury Manor. The house had been in the family for many years, but the early death of Violet's father and the strains of the Second World War had pushed the family into reduced circumstances. Violet's grieving mother had been forced to sell the house. Violet didn't dwell on these sad things, but instead talked about the fun she'd had growing up amid servants in the halcyon years between the 2 wars. She talked about the sliver of Silver River that flowed through the grounds, the green lawns running down to its very banks. There was a small boat shed where 2 wooden boats were stored, their masts tucked neatly inside and coarse canvas sails stowed tidily under the masts. Freddie always loved hearing about the boats. Violet said she used to play in them, although she never sailed them. Freddie sighed. She would have sailed down the river with her friends. There were always friends in her daydreams of sailing, 2 girls and 2 boys. Jamie and she would be invited to be their allies in a war against the adults. Jamie liked to hear about the enormous kitchen and the delights that appeared daily from within. Sumptuous afternoon teas with cakes and buns, lemonade brought outside on a silver tray to the family seated underneath the cedar tree in the summertime. He dreamed of pilfering apples and cherries from the orchard, of catching fish in the river and being smuggled toffee and fudge by a friendly ally, the cook. Now he could add climbing the cedar tree and jumping out at people in the bedroom to his imaginings. Jamie longed for wide open spaces and a gang of boys to run wild with. None of the boys at school seemed interested in going outside and waging war or digging for treasure. They liked sitting inside playing computer games, something Jamie could not understand. "Granny, you've never told us why you moved away from Alnbury Manor," Freddie said. "I know that you said your mother had to sell the house, but why?" There was silence as Violet seemed to drag her thoughts from the happy nursery scenes playing tricks on Miss Wilkes to what was going on in the adult world at that time. My father died very young, you know. He was only in his 40s when he died quite suddenly, and Mother didn't really know how to cope without him. Then the war came, the Second War, and the servants left." Violet gave a small sigh. "After the war, the taxes were so high, Mother really couldn't keep the place going, and so she had to sell. We moved in with my aunt, well, you know that." Freddie and Jamie nodded. Violet had not enjoyed living with her strict aunt, and it seemed that there were no fun stories to be told about that period of her life. "What did your father, great-great-grandfather Henry, die of?" Jamie asked, looking up with curious eyes. He'd finished sharpening his stick and had made a couple of exploratory throws, testing it out as a spear. It stuck in the wet earth quite pleasingly. "Did he die of a horrible disease, leprosy or something?" Violet's lips twitched at the leprosy remark. "Jamie," Freddie shushed her brother, "of course he didn't die of leprosy. He probably had a heart attack or something. Did he, Granny?" "No, he didn't die of a heart attack. Well, not a heart attack really. I've always thought he died of a broken heart, which I think is probably quite different to a heart attack, don't you?" Violet spoke in a quiet, thoughtful tone. Freddie looked at her sharply. What do you mean, Granny? I've heard of people dying from a broken heart, but I thought that was something to do with being in love with someone who didn't love you, or who died or something. Is that what happened to your father? Violet sighed and shook her head. No, darling. My parents loved one another, I am sure of that. No. Violet paused for a long time. Jamie eventually stopped throwing his spear and looked at Violet, puzzled by the break in the story. Well, what broke his heart then? Seems like a silly way to die to me. Jamie, Freddie frowned. She turned back to Violet. You don't have to tell us if you don't want to, Granny. We don't need to know. Violet patted Freddie's hand and smiled softly. She remained silent, as though remembering, reliving times long gone. Eventually she seemed to doze off, and Freddie gently moved her hand from under Violet's and beckoned for Jamie to follow her back into the kitchen. Freddie thought the subject of what had happened to her great-great-grandfather was closed, but at tea-time Violet herself brought up the subject. Jamie had helped Nina make a lemon sponge cake and was licking the icing-covered spatula with glee. Violet set the table in front of the Aga with plates and forks, and Freddie made the tea. She called to her father, who'd been locked in his study all day. Tom smiled when he saw the cake. Get much work done? Nina asked, looking up from pouring the tea. Jamie brandished a large knife and was slicing huge hunks of cake for everybody. Careful with that knife, Jamie, you'll have someone's eye out. Tom took a chair and smiled sheepishly at his family. Well, not as much as I'd have liked. I thought I'd just finished my book, and before I knew it, time had run away from me, and to cut a long story short, I only managed an hour or so of actual work. He looked apologetically at Nina. Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe? She asked with one eyebrow raised inquisitively and her fork poised over her slab of cake. Tom watched the lemon icing drip from the cake onto the plate. He met her eyes. Marlowe. Tom was an American, and he loved reading thrillers from the 1920s and 30s. He had watched every Humphrey Bogart film many times over, and the children had too. But Tom's favourites were the novels of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. Private investigators Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe were true heroes to Tom. Fast-talking, honourable men who had always a witty comeback no matter the situation. They were private detectives, working for themselves, not huge, soulless organisations in cramped cubicles staring at numbers on a screen all day. They roamed the mean streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco, kissed beautiful women, and righted wrongs. Nina nodded. Her battered copy of The Secret Adversary lay open on the table, where she'd put it down to help Jamie make the cake. She'd been reading too. Funny how you can read some books over and over again and never tire of them, even though you know what happens, she remarked. I must have read Swallows and Amazons at least 10 times, Mum, and I still love it, and that doesn't count the times I've read the other books in the series, Freddie said. Nina grinned. Yes, you do seem to love that book. I loved it too when I was a girl, and the film. That was good as well. Jamie had quietly finished his cake and looked inquisitively at his mother, wondering if he should risk asking for a second piece. Nina caught his eye and nodded towards the cake. Go on then, but just a small slice this time, Jamie. Please, Jamie carved a smaller slice of cake. Minuscule, really, he thought, as he placed it on his plate. Hardly a mouthful, really. He turned to his dad. I made a great catapult today, Dad. He pulled it out of his shorts pocket and thrust it under his father's nose. Tom took it admiringly and tested the rubber band, stretching it in his strong fingers. That's a beauty, Jamie. I'd have loved one of these when I was a boy. What are those cuts on your hand? Oh, nothing, just some scratches from where I was sharpening my spear. I wish there were some rabbits or something here that I could hunt. I'm sure I could catch some with it. It's very sharp. We used to have poachers in our wood, Violet interjected. My father used to turn a blind eye to them. He said if they were desperate enough to come and catch rabbits, then good luck to them. Some landowners used to set man-traps, you know, great rusty spiky things that could break a man's leg if he stepped on it. Freddie shivered. Why would someone come and poach rabbits? They were hungry, darling. Well, some were hungry, but I think we also had our share of boys who liked to come and catch rabbits just for a bit of fun. Boys like Jamie there. Children seemed to have a lot more fun when you were a girl, Granny, Jamie said. I mean, to climb trees, plenty of targets to hit with your catapult, rabbits to poach, yummy food. It's not nearly so much fun today. All I can really do is read about fun things. Mr. Hopkins said that if he catches anyone at school with a catapult, they'll be sent to see the head and their parents called in. Violet laughed. I think boys had their catapults confiscated even when I was young. Boys and catapults always seem to equal mischief. Well, I still think you had more fun than we do. In some ways, maybe. I did have a big garden and house to run around in, and there were plenty of places to hide. But you have a lot more toys and entertainment than I did. You have the TV and computer and a lot more books than I had. Also, you have a sister. I would have loved a sister to play with. Jamie crinkled up his nose. Girls, he said darkly. I think you're pretty lucky to have Freddie. Tom said to his son. "As girls go, your mother, Granny and Freddie are probably about as good as they get. One might almost include them as honorary boys." Jamie wasn't convinced. "Who did you play with then, Granny?" he asked. "Oh, sometimes children would come with their parents and I would have a playmate for a few days. I didn't ever have anybody for long, though. And once we moved to Aunt Sybil's, there was no one at all. Aunt Sybil didn't like having people to stay." "She sounds very different to your parents," said Freddie. "It sounds as though your parents were always having parties." "They were. It was lots of fun. After my father died, though, Mother didn't have any more parties. The last party was when I was 8 years old. It was a Midsummer's Eve party. Father died 3 months later, and we didn't have any more parties, not even at Christmas time." "You didn't tell us what your father died from, Granny," Jamie said, turning his blue eyes on Violet. "You said he died of a broken heart. Did he, Mum?" Nina set down her mug of tea and dabbed her lips with her napkin. She took a long, hard look at her grandmother. "Did you tell them he died of a broken heart?" she asked gently. Violet's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. Nina leaned forward and hugged the older woman. Freddie looked on in distress. "Granny, it really doesn't matter." "It's all right, Freddie," said Violet, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "Don't know why I got so upset. It was all such a long time ago now." Tom had reached forward and calmly taken the knife from Jamie's hand. Jamie had been absent-mindedly tapping the jam jar lid with it, embarrassed that he might have been responsible for making Violet cry. Jamie left the table and squished in next to his dad on the armchair that stood in front of the fire. Tom ruffled Jamie's hair gently to show him he didn't have to worry. "It was that last party. You remember I told you that the last party we held was a Midsummer's Eve party?" Freddie and Jamie both nodded. Nina patted Violet's arm and put the kettle back on to boil. Violet took a deep breath. "Well, there were lots of guests, as usual. There were some local friends, as well as some people Father had met in London, some Americans who had been introduced to Father by an old friend, Bobby Strangways. Bobby was always a bit wild, Mother said, with some colourful friends, but these Americans seemed nice enough. Mother thought they were a bit rough around the edges, but they were very rich and behaved themselves. They thought England and our house and customs were terribly quaint. Mother's old school friend, Lady Penelope, and her maid were also staying. Also, Colonel Boys was there. He was an old army friend of my grandfather. Colonel Boys had brought a friend of his, a funny little detective, from Luxembourg, Monsieur Renaud. Those were the house guests. Of course, many other people came to the party, local people, the vicar, and Dr. Stillwater and so forth. The party was so beautiful. Violet's eyes shone as she described the decorations, the music, the clothes, and the food. Jamie's ears pricked up as dish after dish was described in exquisite detail. Mother and Father declared the party a great success. I had been allowed to stay up until 10 o'clock, and then I watched from the staircase, though Miss Wilkes thought I was tucked up in bed. It was magical. The garden was filled with lanterns strung between the trees, and the guests danced on the terrace to a jazz band that had travelled down from London. Midsummer's Eve is the longest day, you know, so it didn't really get properly dark until late, and at midnight we had fireworks. She paused, took a deep breath and continued, the smile fading from her pink cheeks. I should mention the Bellamy bird. Violet paused and sighed. The Bellamy bird was a statue of a bird of prey, an eagle or a falcon, made out of solid gold, with 2 perfect sapphire eyes, holding an enormous ruby in its open beak. It had been in the family for generations, a gift, Father said, to one of his ancestors, from an Indian prince who my father's ancestor had rescued from certain death. Jamie's eyes were wide. "Where is it now?" he breathed. Violet smiled sadly. "It was stolen, that night, the night of the party." It had become a tradition that once a year on Midsummer's Eve the Bellamy bird would be put on display in the house. Usually it was kept in the bank for safekeeping because it was priceless. At the stroke of midnight, Father took a small group of guests down to the secret chamber where it was kept when it came to the house. That year, when Father took the guests down to see the bird, it was gone. Father was still reeling from this shock when the house was thrown into an uproar the next morning. Lady Penelope had awoken and was screaming that her jewels had been stolen. Not, thankfully, the famous ruby necklace that she had been wearing at the party, but several other very valuable pieces. She shrieked enough, I can tell you. You'd think she was being murdered in her bed. Freddie and Jamie leaned forward in their seats, totally absorbed by the gripping tale. "Did they find the jewels and the statue?" Jamie asked breathlessly. "They searched and searched, but didn't find a thing. The police came, of course, and turned the place upside down, but they said the thieves must have planned it all very carefully, and the stolen items were probably out of the country already. Mr. Gutson, one of the Americans, was very unkind to Father. He'd been so nice, giving me American candy, but he became ugly and hateful when the bird was taken. He said he'd travelled to England with the express purpose of buying the bird from Father. He was quite obsessed with having it, despite the fact Father had refused to sell it to him. Mr. Gutson as good as accused Father of having something to do with its disappearance, said he'd make sure Father's name was mud. Father was dreadfully worried about it all. He couldn't believe one of his friends would steal, but who else could it have been? And he blamed himself for having lost something that had been in his family for generations. You have to understand that, in those days, men took their reputations and honour very seriously. Duels were fought over the slightest questioning of honour. A man accused of cheating at cards might well blow his brains out rather than face the shame of suspicion. Father took it very hard. Mother tried to reassure him. I heard her tell him over and over that it wasn't his fault, that someone had heard the bird would be on display, and must have heard about our wealthy guests. The Americans had been so ostentatious, flaunting their money, and everyone knew Lady Penelope had one of the most envied collections of jewels in Europe. Father wouldn't be comforted, however. He felt that his old friends were avoiding him at the club in London, and soon he refused to leave the house, staying locked in his study. I had to be extra quiet. Really, it was as if someone had died. "What about the detective?" Jamie asked suddenly. "The detective from Belgium?" "Luxembourg. He wasn't any help. Kept going off on wild goose chases. He would disappear for days on end, driving off in the car, being very cryptic. No, he didn't find anything. After a couple of months, Father's health had completely broken down, and Mother called in Dr. Stillwater. It was no good, he said. It was as though Father didn't want to get better. A month later, he was dead. Died in his sleep. I don't think he ever got over the theft, and he couldn't recover. I heard him telling my mother she'd be better off without him. It was awful. Anyway, that's what happened. I'd give anything to be able to go back in time, back to the party and spy on the 2 rooms from which the valuables were stolen. I've thought time and time again how I wish I'd not just stayed watching through the banisters." "It's very sad, Granny," said Nina. She'd heard the story before. "But there's nothing you could have done. You were just a child. You couldn't be expected to prevent a robbery." "I wish I'd been there," said Jamie fiercely. "I'd have a gang of outlaws, like in Just William, and we'd soon track down the jewel thieves and recover the loot. We'd have got a nice reward too, I imagine." Violet smiled despite herself. "You would have been a very useful person to have with me at the party. We might have stopped the robbery or caught the thieves red-handed." End of Chapter 1. To read more from the Bellamy Bird, please go to Amazon.com or go to my website www.clairehavensauthor.com. Thank you.